Really pleased to have you all with us today and to welcome people online. So I hope you can hear everything, see everything and wave it as if not. It's really great to have this event today, and Caitlin's going to introduce it properly in a minute. I just wanted to flag up the fact that we're organising this in part to celebrate the first 10 years of the Environment and Sustainability Institute. So we're actually in our first decade now. Some people have been here for a long time, much longer than me, and we're celebrating that 10 years by highlighting some of the collaborations that we've built over that time. So if you look on our website, there's a link right at the end of the page called ESI at 10, and all our events are listed there. Anne-Rita's been doing a great job, and we've got the logo for ESI at 10. If you're not getting information from us, you can also sign up for the ESI newsletter, so you'll get postings about the events. And please do come along to everything and feel very much at home in this building. Some of the highlights that are coming up are a collaboration with ECEHH, which is the European Centre Group for Environment and Human Health, based in Truro. That's on coastal communities. An event with Renew, led by Kevin at the back there, on personalised ecology. We have a symposium, a 2-day symposium on evolutionary environmental stimulants of pathogen emergence. That's with the CEC, the Centre for Ecology and Conservation. And we have other exciting events. So please look on there. Please sign up for the newsletter. Really pleased to have you all here. And of course, this was pitched as an early career researcher event. We're featuring two of our first ever ECRs, Ben and Sarah. But we do also have monthly events lined up for the ECR network too in this building. So again, follow that and please do come along. So warm welcome and over to Caitlin.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you everybody in the room and everybody online for being here. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the intention of this event before we kick off. But we have a really exciting group of people here to listen to and to talk with. We'll have some discussion at the end of this session. Sarah Crowley and Ben Phillips will each be sharing their experiences around traveling through, in and out of transdisciplinarity. Sorry, all you can see is my back online. And we also have Kevin Gaston, and I've got titles here if I can read them. Professor of Biodiversity and Conservation in the ESI, and Kevin was the founding director of the ESI back 10 years ago, but as he just reminded me that journey started more like 12 years ago at least. Steve Hinchliffe is Professor of Human Geography at Streatham and has come all the way down the A30 to join us. Thank you very much. Robbie McDonald is Professor of Natural Environment here in the ESI and has also been here since the beginning. And Juliet Osborne is Professor of Applied Ecology in the ESI and has been here since 2012. So there's a lot of history here, actually. But what's exciting about the way that we framed this today is you don't get the sort of crusty elders telling you about the journey. It's actually about the people who have been working with us and starting out on their careers and trying to make sense of what it means to be in an interdisciplinary research institute. So hopefully that will be useful for some of you and interesting for others. But before we begin, I just want to talk a little bit about the metaphor of travel. This is an image that I took many, many years ago somewhere in, I think it's in eastern Washington state, of a deer crossing. But the point here is, we chose the title not just because it's alliterative, but actually because there's something about transdisciplinarity, which is actually really hard to fix and sort of stick down, I think. It's quite a slippery concept. We don't ever really know whether we're doing it or not. And if we do it, then we might not realize that we've just done it until it's in the rearview mirror, I think. So there's something about moving through and sort of not quite arriving at being transdisciplinary. And that's one of the things I want to draw out a little bit today. And hopefully that will come out in the discussion. We do, arguably need definitions. So you don't have to scratch the surface much to find different people defining transdisciplinarity in different ways. I've decided to adopt some definitions from colleagues who worked on the Valuing Nature program, and I think Kevin and others were involved in that. But these were artists working with scientists, and their definition of transdisciplinarity is researchers from 2 or more disciplines and this is key, actors from outside academia interacting across conventional disciplinary boundaries, incorporating different types of knowledge to create a holistic approach in addressing common themes or problems. And so what I think is interesting about that definition is how, unlike multi and inter and cross, the trans has 2 meanings, right? So you're transcending disciplinary boundaries, but you're also transcending the boundaries that divide us as academics from the people out in the world who are the practitioners and the policymakers. And so it's that spirit of transdisciplinarity and its 2 meanings, and people fight about these meanings. I realized I did a little peek into the literature, and there's a lot of argument about which trans is dominant. But I think the whole point is actually that the term leaves space for both of these kinds of engagement. And that's very much in the spirit of what we've been doing in the ESI for the last decade, is always reaching outside academia, bringing in other people, trying to figure out how to make knowledge together. So just a little bit more on transdisciplinarity. As with any travel, there are a lot of people who will give you directions and tell you how to do transdisciplinary research. So you have to decide which signs you want to follow, what you're interested in doing. And there also is quite a lot of research, particularly in the last few years, with sort of guides around how to do transdisciplinary research. So like different conceptual frameworks, different discussions around capabilities, talking about transdisciplinary as a discipline in its own right, which is kind of confusing. And so while this literature is useful, I think the key thing here is that when you're working in a transdisciplinary way, it's actually quite creative and generative and a little bit unpredictable. If you're trying to fuse your knowledge and come up with a holistic way of thinking about something, you can't map that out in advance necessarily. But I think it's probably fair to say that although transdisciplinary research sort of was the journey of transdisciplinarity as defined by that term started in 1970, arguably, it's sort of maturing at this point and becoming much more mainstream. And there's actually quite a lot of expertise here at the university around how we do transdisciplinary research, but also teaching. And I promised Carrie, Caitlin, and Nikki that I would highlight this event that's happening on the 8th of February, Transdisciplinary Pedagogy, what capabilities are needed for transdisciplinary learning and work. And this is a partnership between Exeter and the Transdisciplinary School at the University of Technology, Sydney. And it's very exciting, actually. Their website is very whizzy and interesting. So definitely worth going along to that seminar if you're interested. I think just before handing it over to Sarah and Dan, I just wanted to say a little bit about, when you're traveling, often you will need to cross borders. And I won't call on you, Steve, at this point, but there are different ways of being on borders and crossing borders. And I think some of what hopefully we're going to hear about sort of will explore the transit that's involved in transdisciplinarity. Now, these are 2 friendly porous borders. Well, actually, one of them is porous. The other one is fluid, but not friendly. We're looking at the Canadian United States border here in northern Vermont, near where I grew up, and it's actually marked by a row of petunias. So sometimes when you're doing transdisciplinary work, it's actually very comfortable, and it's like, okay, here we are, we all understand what we're doing, we can smell the flowers, we can actually get stuck in. This border is actually the Norwegian-Russian border, but it's a river border, far north in Finnmark, and I was there a few months ago, and it's a fascinating border where there is no bridge. There's a really very little recognition of that border, and yet the landscape itself is very open and inviting, and you could just take a boat and paddle out, and you wouldn't know you'd crossed the border until the Russians hopped into their boat on the other side and zipped out, say hello. So it's quite a curious border, that one. And I guess as with any borders, when you're doing transdisciplinary work, there's often an element of border control where it's like, okay, you're getting along fine, everything's working well, the disciplines are all integrating and exchanging, and then you hit the buffers. And some of the places where that happens are sort of when you go for a job. And there was one colleague here on this campus who told me a story about how we went for a job in the biosciences department. They said, well, wouldn't you be more comfortable in the geography department? And they went for a job in the geography department. And they said, I think you probably belong in the biosciences department. And he was like, okay, Right, so we can be transdisciplinary, but you also have to get a job. And another place where that kind of border control has happened, although I think is probably happening a lot less, is when you're applying for grants, where you have to kind of name your discipline and belong. Even if you're crossing over, you need to have a disciplinary identity. And interestingly, that's starting to shift. So I have the announcement here of this new cross-council responsive mode pilot scheme, where UKRI is putting £32 million up for people who are going to transcend, combine, or significantly span disciplines. So bridging there. And they're looking for breakthrough or disruptive interdisciplinary ideas. And interestingly, one more line here. Awards will be potentially transformative for participating disciplines or lead to the creation of new disciplines. All right, so this is a big ambition here. So, but do we need new disciplines or just do we need to have better borders? So just in closing, oh no, a couple more slides here. I think one thing that's been really important to me and the work that I've done with other disciplines and often crossing over between the arts, the social sciences, the arts and humanities is a recognition of what Tim Acott has talked about as epistemological equity. And so this is actually Tim speaking at an event a couple months ago in London as part of the Creative Reflections event. And he defines epistemological equity as creating conditions in research to equally value appropriate contributions from diverse disciplinary and non-disciplinary perspectives. And for me, that's about working with people who are as curious about how you make knowledge about the world as you are curious about how they make knowledge about the world. So it's really that shared sense of figuring out, and when you don't understand each other, being willing to talk about how and why. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah first to speak a little bit about her transdisciplinary travels, but first I wanted to just make a note about a curious border here, because I suppose one way to think about transdisciplinary work is about, building bridges, and this particular bridge is fascinating. I'm not actually sure this is entirely relevant, but I found this example and I was like, wow, this is really quite cool. So we have Zambia, Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe here, and it could be an international quadrupoint border, but it isn't, because actually there's this funny little strip where Botswana meets Zambia, and they've only just recently built this bridge. But as you can see, the grayed out areas here, it's actually going directly from between two countries, and there is no meeting point for those other two. So they're completely cut out from the border space there. And it's, for some reason, this image just sort of resonated with me, because sometimes sort of trans or interdisciplinary work can feel a little bit like this, where you're like, well, you're going to include this bit and not that bit. And just being on the bridge or in the river can be much more challenging. So I'm now going to, turn it over to Sarah, but I think that was just an introduction to some of the things that I think we might pick up in the conversation. So we now have Sarah for 15 minutes. And then Ben is going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we have a whole 45 minutes to hear from our distinguished panel and have a discussion with everybody else in the room. So I will now try and find your presentation, Sarah. Oops, where did she put? Which one are you? This one. Yeah, on the wrong phone. Okay. Yeah, no, we got it, I think. Yeah.
So, about a year or so into my PhD here in the ESI, I found myself in conversation with a visiting speaker. And the visiting speaker asked, what is your PhD about? And I said, well, it's an interdisciplinary PhD, and I'm looking at the social and ecological dimensions of managing invasive species. And until that point, most of the responses I got to that had been curiosity, perhaps some enthusiasm, because interdisciplinarity was the trendy thing at the time. But in this case, what the speaker actually did was pull this face and say, well, good luck with that. In my experience, interdisciplinary PhDs tend to be a little bit of a car crash. So I'm telling you this story for two reasons. The first reason is that I'm a good student and I listen to my supervisors. And Robbie always told me that I should memorize the first line of any talk that I was going to give. And Robbie always told, no, that's Robbie, Steve always told me that I should start with a story. And so I've done both of those things, and I hope it goes well. And the second reason, and probably the more important reason I'm telling you this, is because I've really remembered that comment from that visiting speaker. And the reason I've remembered that comment is because it really spoke to existing anxieties that I had at the time about what interdisciplinarity was, about what doing interdisciplinary research would look like, and indeed whether or not it was going to end up as a giant car crash. So, starting with interdisciplinarity then, as this definition that we're thinking with today, this idea of these two or more disciplines interacting across a disciplinary boundary, combining ideas to come up with new things. So two separate disciplines meeting in the middle. And that was kind of the idea of my PhD. This was the eventual title of my PhD. So my PhD was a series of case studies looking at controversies and tensions around the management of introduced species, the monk parakeet, the grey squirrel, and curveball, the reintroduction of the Eurasian beaver, because that happened while I was doing my PhD and was very, very interesting. And so these are all kind of environmental, ecological issues or challenges. But actually, my PhD was very much social research. In fact, some might say that it is a geography PhD with biosciences stamped across the front of it. Because what I really did was I applied contemporary theory from the social sciences and very traditional social research methods like interviews and documentary analysis to better understand the human conflicts surrounding these kinds of interactions. So the way you can tell it's a little bit interdisciplinary is that it's a hybrid format PhD. It's quite unusual looking. It's a series of papers, as they do in biosciences, but with a methods section, which they do in geography. And you can also tell that it's interdisciplinary because the journal outputs range from Journal of Applied Ecology to Environment and Planning E. So it spans a couple of different disciplinary boundaries there. But effectively, you could argue that my research wasn't actually that interdisciplinary, because I used social research methods pretty much solely throughout. I was just applying them to ecological challenges. But I still kind of think that there was an element of interdisciplinarity in it. And then when I thought about it more, what I realized was that the interdisciplinary element in my PhD was actually me. I was the interdisciplinary bit. And I'm going to explain that to you a little bit more, because even though we're mostly talking about post-PhD here, I think it's worth showing you something that occurred to me a little bit later on, which is, so this is my A-level choices. This is what I have A-levels in. As you can see, biology, psychology, philosophy, religion, ethics, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, wasn't settled. Went on a journey in animal behavior for my undergraduate degree, followed by a crash course in social anthropology to do an MA in anthrozoology, followed by the addition of geography at PhD level. And it is a running joke that I'm probably the only person in the geography department who doesn't actually have a GCSE in geography. So this is, the reason this is interesting is because it says a little bit about me. And why am I like this is the question that I have asked myself. And it's not because 20 years ago when I was choosing my A-levels, I wanted to be talking about interdisciplinary research in 20 years' time. And it's also not because I couldn't decide what I was interested in, which is what you might think looking at this. It's because I have always known what I'm interested in. And what I'm interested in is something that crosses all of these different disciplines. So this is what I'm interested in and always have been, right? The area that I work in is human-animal interaction. Specifically and more broadly, it's relationships between people and the wider living world. These are the things that I have been interested in for years and years and years. And it just so happens, and actually it's no coincidence that these are the titles of the two undergraduate modules that I teach at this university, and also the title of the journal that I'm an associate editor of. So this is what I really love, right? This is what I do. And it just so happens that these things are coalescence points for lots and lots of different disciplines. And that's meant, so I show this slide to my undergraduates to scare them at the beginning of a human-animal interactions course with all the things they're going to have to engage with. And I realized also I missed history, archaeology, and probably some others off here. So, if you work in this area and this is what you're interested in, lots of other people are too. And they're coming at it from lots of different angles, and they're coming at it with lots of different techniques and ideas, and they're interested in different bits of the same phenomenon. But because I'm interested in the broader topic, I'm interested in all of those things. And that's kind of how I've ended up being a little bit like I am. And I actually think this is a really useful thing to think about in terms of interdisciplinary projects as well. Because if they coalesce around something, that you all find interesting, but you have different angles and approaches to and takes on, then at least you've got something really interesting in common in the centre. So I took my interdisciplinary self and went and continued here at the ESI into a postdoctoral position, where we started this marvelous program on cats, cat owners, and wildlife. So in this particular project, I was cast as the social scientist because I had now got lots of experience in social research from my PhD. So I'm not the interdisciplinary one necessarily here. I'm the social scientist in this project, and I was working with Martina here, who's visiting at the moment. So welcome, Martina, who was the ecologist working with cats on the project, and also with Robbie, who by now had read a bit of Latour and a bit of Haraway, so thinks he's also a social scientist. We started out on this project to work with cat owners to help them identify ways to manage their cats to reduce the amount of wildlife that they kill. So it's both a social and an ecological research project, but I'm going to make the argument that it was multidisciplinary, because we did effectively some separate research and then we put it together to come up with recommendations and ideas. I was working with cat owners, looking at social drivers and their reasons for doing what they did with their cats. And Martina was working with cats and tracking them and measuring their diets and all sorts of useful things to find out what cats were doing. So this was us bringing together these different disciplinary techniques into one project. I don't love this definition, actually, because it's got this but on the end, but without altering their disciplinary approaches or developing a common conceptual framework. And it sounds a bit like it's saying it's not quite as good as the other ones. But I don't think that's true. I think the proof is in the pudding. So we've got 9 papers out of this project, and they are in a whole range of areas. And we've actually come up with some really, really cool findings from integrating these two kind of traditional sets of methods together in one project. And we've been able to find out some really interesting things about cat owners, what drives them, what makes them tick, and also how they manage their cats, and then also go on from that to find out what the things that owners do with their cats affect the cat's ecology. So this is neat. But it's not the thing that I think is most exciting about this project. What's most exciting about this project is what we're doing with it now, which is we're building a consortium of organizations who are interested in cats and the environment more broadly. Because much like disciplines, this has been pretty siloed in the past. We've got veterinarians, we've got welfare people, we've got ecologists who are concerned about impacts on birds, and they haven't really worked together or even spoken to each other very much. So we've been building this consortium and had a really successful meeting last year with a lot of these people, thinking about how areas we agree on, disagree on, and areas where we could work together in future for research and also on guidance for cat owners, which is really, really important. And so that's where we're moving into this area of transdisciplinarity, where we're bringing in people from outside of our disciplines and our research areas with these interests and expertise to help kind of transcend these disciplinary things to focus on this particular problem, which, much like all human-animal interaction problems, crosses a whole load of disciplinary boundaries. So that's the transdisciplinary part. So does that mean that I'm no longer an interdisciplinary researcher, but I'm in fact a transdisciplinary researcher? Well, it works okay when you're talking about projects, but I don't really like it when you're talking about people because it sounds a bit smug. I have transcended disciplines now. I am above, but also quite a lot of the research I do isn't transdisciplinary. It's very specifically responding to very specific problems, and we need particular techniques to do that, right? So that's not even really true. And then a colleague of mine said, actually, I quite like using undisciplined now. I'm an undisciplined researcher, and that's kind of fun because I like the rebelliousness of it, but also it sounds a bit sloppy. It sounds a bit like undisciplined. You're not really doing anything properly. And actually I do, no matter what I'm working on, I do care a lot about the robustness of research and quality. So I'm not really that one either. So actually I just describe myself as a researcher. And to people outside of academia, that's all you really need, because they don't really care about disciplines anyway. They just want to know what you're researching. So for the most part, this is actually the term that I use. So I'm just going to finish then with a few lessons from my travels that hopefully you can take with you for another day. So first, being interdisciplinary is great. You get to learn lots of new things all the time. You're always learning, and that's brilliant. You get to try things and go into new areas, and I would never want to stop doing that. But the downside is try not to dabble. Don't do a little bit of it. Learn how to do it properly. If you're going to move into another area, find out how that works. And you can do that by respecting the often much more disciplined skills and expertise of people who are already working in that area and have probably been doing it for longer than you are. Collaborate with people on a similar vein who respect you and one another. Probably the reason my PhD wasn't in fact a car crash is because Robbie and Steve, even though they come from very different backgrounds in terms of academic work, they actually quite like each other. And that helps. I mean, he's not sure. But they definitely respect the approaches and will have a conversation and feedback. And that's hugely important, right? Be flexible on the small stuff, because actually a lot of the things that we do within disciplines, and when you've moved between them like me, you see this more clearly, is based on convention rather than any good reason most of the time. So, you know, don't worry too much about citation styles, and don't worry too much about the way in which we hold conference presentations, for example, because you can adapt to those things. But another lesson from Steve here, stand up for yourself when it counts. Which is that as someone who crosses between disciplines, you might be able to see when someone else has got their disciplinary blinkers on and isn't seeing the bigger picture or another way of coming at it. So the world is sadly, as Caitlin was saying, not quite set up for us yet. And the analogy I would use is that being interdisciplinary is a bit like being left-handed, which incidentally, I also am. So my fellow lefties will know that even though we can do everything just as well as everybody else can, the world is not very well set up in some cases for being left-handed. Scissors, useless, rulers, pain, absolute nightmare. And my actual nemesis, the cake fork, not designed for left-handed people. And so it goes with interdisciplinarity, right? So I still have to submit to a ref category in a particular discipline. I still have to decide whether I'm NERC facing or ESRC facing, and neither of them really want me, so it doesn't really matter. And we have to find ways to deal with that. So you have to find workarounds, right? So you might have to look for alternate funding sources who might be interested in the kind of work you're doing. You might need to find publication venues that will help you to publish the work that you're doing. This is getting better, as Caitlin was saying. But when I started, 10 years ago, this wasn't really the case. You're still operating in a very disciplined world. So I'm going to finish with one other little story. So it's another visiting speaker. About this time last year, actually, I was up in Streatham with Steve's research group and a visiting speaker. And one of the PhD students at dinner was explaining how they were struggling with kind of bringing together all these disciplinary ideas and concepts and theories that were coming at them. And they said that their own supervisor had described them as an epistemological mess. But I misheard this, and I said, did you just say your supervisor called you an epistemological menace? The student said no, but very quickly Steve said, no, Sarah, you're the epistemological menace. And so my final bit of advice, I don't think you meant it as a compliment, but I'm taking it. My final bit of advice is to be an epistemological menace, because I kind of like the disruptive side of that, because that's the whole point of interdisciplinary research in a way. So I am an epistemological menace. I am probably undisciplined. I find it very difficult to get funding. However, I'm having a good time. I'm doing some cool stuff. And so far, the car is still on the road. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. All right. Is that done?
That's going to be quite a hard act to follow. And to be honest, Sarah is someone who I've always looked up to as a really good example of someone who does transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research. So it's a bit of a shame that I have to start this talk by saying that I actually don't do transdisciplinary research. But I can talk to you about my experience of basically moving between research areas, basically sort of in the pursuit of trying to do research that I feel like makes a difference. And in the process, trying to use all kinds of different methods that I'm completely unqualified to be using, and just generally being completely out of my depth. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So it's going to be a bit less travels and transdisciplinarity, and it's going to be a bit more sort of about my identity crisis research scientist, but hopefully that'll be okay. So I've been at the ESI since 2015. I started off doing a master's by research with Juliet and Roz. That was in pollinator conservation. I stayed on to do a PhD with Juliet because I liked my master's so much. Also working with Kevin. Where is Kevin? There he is at the back. That was about how we can manage road verges for pollinators still, but also for nature more broadly, and thinking even more broadly about the environment and people as part of that. Once I was doing that, I had some big realizations, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But as a result of that, or coming out of that, I did a couple of postdocs. One of them was with Robbie and Sarah on dormice, but I had quite a big component thinking about people. And then my job now, working with Kevin on a project that I'll talk to you about in a minute as well, which is almost completely focusing on people. So changing research areas quite a lot, and I'm going to talk through these in more detail, which sort of explain why that happened. This big realization I had during my PhD, which sort of bit of a crisis really, made me do some side projects, focusing more and more on sort of social sciences until what I'm doing now. But just before that, I wanted to mention that actually I think the most sort of transformative thing that I've done since being in the SI was a job that I did before my PhD. And basically what happened is I finished my master's degree. I had about 9 months, I think, when I was trying to get PhDs with Juliet, and before that PhD started. So basically I needed a job, and a job came up in the SI, and it was called Research Impact Coordinator, which, to be honest, I probably had no idea what that actually meant at the time. And the bit that I did know, I definitely didn't feel qualified to do it. But I did apply for it, and I did get it in the end. Although I have to admit that I wasn't the first choice for the job, which is even more awkward because Juliet was the one choosing. But I did get that job, and it was such an incredible experience, and it involved lots of stuff. Working with academics across the whole ESI. Part of it was sort of looking at what people were doing, the impact they were having outside of their research, whether that's sort of external engagement or impacts on policy, stuff like that, and trying to sort of record that and get a good record of all that stuff that was going on. Also applying for things like small pots of money so that more work like that could be done, helping to run workshops and stuff. Actually, sometimes it was literally just covering the reception desk whilst Mark was busy. But all of that stuff was so useful because it gave me a real insight into the sort of depth and breadth of research that was going on in the SI, and gave me experience of the different ways and that people work and think in different fields. So I worked with Caitlin quite a bit, and for example, Caitlin just released her book at the time, and there's lots of stuff coming out of that. And just reading, if you haven't read Caitlin's book, Curated Decay, you should definitely read that. There's a free plug for you, Caitlin. But that was so amazing to get such a different perspective that you wouldn't if you just stay within your disciplinary boundaries. So everything that I did that follows that hopefully sort of reflects the experiences that I got from that real short 6-month role. And I think there's a bit of a discussion to be had about, well, I found that so useful personally. Is there a way that we can kind of replicate that for other people in the SI who might want some kind of similar, maybe smaller version of that experience? But anyway, on to these examples. So following that position, I started my PhD, and that was about basically how do we make road verges better for nature. So this is a road verge. They often have got lots of flowers in, lots of insects, lots of small mammals. They can be really good for nature, but generally they're not managed for nature. And that means that in the countryside, some guy will come along in the middle of summer and mow that whole thing down. That's when it's got the most life in it of all the year, so probably the worst time you could be doing that. And kind of as a result of that, there's been a lot of public backlash trying to change this, big public campaigns over the last 10 years trying to change things. So Juliet suggested maybe we do a PhD on this. I thought, great, it seems like a relatively simple problem, potentially relatively simple solutions, something that I could do some research on and really make quite a big difference. How wrong I was. But having done that role, that research impact coordinator role, from the very offset of this PhD, I was very focused on, this isn't just about doing research, it's about trying to have impact outside of research, trying to make change. So external engagement was a really big part of that. And then I realized quite quickly that actually we sort of knew what we should be doing. There's a lot of evidence out there already. So maybe it was just about trying to bring that together and sort of package it up and make it accessible for practitioners and for other scientists. So we did a lot of sort of evidence synthesis. And then we did some more sort of sciencey stuff, some big scale thinking, spatial mapping and modeling. We did some much more focused stuff like field studies and experiments to try and fill some of the gaps in our knowledge. And as I said, I was working with Juliet and Kevin. So working with my other supervisor, James Bullock at CEH. I got to work with Karen Hudson-Edwards and Carmen on some stuff around impacts of pollution, road pollution on pollinators and verges. So that was a nice example of, I don't know about interdisciplinary work, or at least a sort of interdisciplinary relationship. Some other people, Lynn Dix and Claire Wallace from Cambridge and UEA, who helped us with evidence synthesis and some other work that they were doing. And we worked with loads of external partners. So we had our case partner, the Cornwall Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty Unit. I've got quite good at saying that without correctly over the years. The conservation charity Bug Life, we did some evidence synthesis work with, and we had really good connections in plant life, butterfly conservation, national highways. So on paper, I feel like we were doing all the right kind of things. We published loads of papers, which is what you do if you want to make a difference or get your stuff out there in academia, at least that's the theory. And we put out a load of press releases to try and publicize the work that we'd done, and that got plenty of traction in the media, which I don't think reflects on us at all. It just shows that this was a topic that the media deemed to be interesting. And then related to that and separate as well, we did loads of external engagement. So replied to countless emails giving advice and recommendations on what people should be doing to members of the public, to highways managers, conservation organisations, local authorities, loads of meetings, webinars, presentations, stuff like that. And the reason I list all this stuff off is actually because, if I'm completely honest with myself, when it comes down to it, I think all the work that we did on this, and I'm scared to say this in front of Juliet and Kevin, I think in terms of actually changing stuff on the ground, which is something that I cared a lot about, I think it made almost no difference. Juliet's face, I'm scared. And the reason I mention it here is because you could argue that the reason for that is that we weren't being transdisciplinary enough. See, I brought it back, Juliet. And that's because we were focusing very much on the sort of ecological side of this problem, when actually we sort of knew what people should be doing, they just weren't doing it. So it's actually a question about people, as a people problem. So how do we get people to change their behavior? How do we get institutions to change their practices? So maybe we weren't being transdisciplinary enough, or maybe we were just working in the wrong discipline altogether in the first place. You could sort of argue it either way. But we did start thinking about this side of the problem. Towards the end of my PhD, I've just put this up because it's just a diagram that was shoved in my thesis last minute. Well, I tried to tackle some of this, the human social part of this problem, but not in any deep and meaningful way. And I guess we sort of ran out of time. But yeah, there's loads that should be done, and maybe I should have focused more on. So that was 4 years of my life that I'll never get back. I'm just kidding. But thinking about disciplinarity, I'd say that this is what we were doing here was kind of multidisciplinary, maybe interdisciplinary at time, maybe should have been a lot more transdisciplinary, although we were working with a lot of external organisations. But anyway, moving on. So second example. So whilst I was having this sort of big realisation during my PhD that actually most, if not all, of conservation, if not all of our environmental problems, we should be focusing on people and understanding how to change people's behaviour, institutions, practices. My friend Jess Knapp, who used to work with Juliet here in the ESI, I think was having some sort of similar realisations. We talk over lunch a lot about this, sort of questioning whether we should be doing slightly different research to what we're doing, or just how depressing it is that we produce all this research and basically doesn't get used. So we thought, okay, maybe we should try and do a little project, nice little fun side project. Famous last words. It wasn't fun. It wasn't small. It took a long time, and it's very painful. But we basically wondered, can we ask, why do people do things for pollinators? People do things like plant wildflowers, don't mow their lawn in May and June, and things like that. And the background to this is there's been so much research done on pollinators, like really an absolute ton. But it all focuses on the sort of ecological, environmental side of that problem. And almost none of it actually asks about how do we actually implement this research, all this research that's been produced. So we worked in Roz and Juliet, and also Jane Clements, who was the only one of us who actually had any sort of formal social sciences background. And initially, Jess and I just wanted to design quite a basic sort of naive questionnaire survey where we'd ask people about how much they know about pollinators, what they're doing to help, why they're doing those things. But with some persuasion, mostly from Roz, we did it a bit better than that, or quite a lot better. Ros got us to actually ground this in some solid theory. So in the end, we used theory of planned behavior, which is a theory that comes from social psychology, which basically tries to explain why people do things in terms of different components of their psychology. So in terms of how capable they feel to do things, their attitudes, what they think other people are doing, things like that. So we came up with this framework, and we designed a questionnaire survey around it, which tries to measure each of these different components. And got loads of people to fill it out, did the data analysis on it, wrote up a paper, published the paper. And I'm not going to, I don't have time to talk in much detail about it, but I just wanted to make a few reflections on that. I'm so glad I did this piece of work, because I got to work with my friends. I got to work in an area that I felt like was kind of more important than some of the research that I was actually doing as part of my PhD in a way, maybe had more potential impact, and learned loads. There's some really great findings that came out of it. But the headline finding that we came up with, that we published it under, is that basically if you want more people to do more things for pollinators or generally for the environment, you need to forget about trying to educate them, increasing the amount of knowledge that they have, and think more about making people feel empowered to do things, making people want to do things in the first place, making people feel like that's a normal thing to do, like other people are doing it, these kinds of things. And we came to this from a sort of pollinator conservation background. And in pollinator conservation, I think this is something that really needed to be said, and people didn't realise. And people are just so focused, and they have this idea of a theory of change where, yeah, if you educate people, their behaviour will change. So it made sense to have this title, I think. But this is essentially a social psychology study. And if a social psychologist saw this, I'm sure plenty of them did, this is a ridiculous thing to say, because it's so basic. It's so well known in other fields in social psychology, probably in the social sciences as a whole everywhere, that it's kind of a joke. So I think this is sort of an interesting quirk of doing research in different disciplines, is what's really obvious in one field isn't necessarily in another. And you can say, well, in this field, we've got this information, you should listen to it. But sometimes you actually just need to do a study and then put a really bloody obvious title for people to pay attention. My other reflection is that we definitely didn't have sufficient expertise to do this project. I think we did a really good job, basically, with what we had. And I think the findings, I think there's some really useful findings in there. And I stand by everything that's in there. And I think that if we did the things that I would like to do, if I got the chance to go back, it wouldn't fundamentally change anything. But knowing a bit more that I do now, looking at it, I think some of the ways that we did some of the things leaves quite a bit to be desired. But at the same time, I think it's better that we did this not perfectly, and that it was done rather than it wasn't done. And it wasn't for lack of trying to get people to help us to do this work. And people like Sarah commented on an early draft of this. We got some help. Ben Wheeler commented on it from the medical school. But essentially, it's social psychology, and we didn't have a social psychologist helping us do this work. But yeah, I think that's something that I learned here. But yeah, I still think it was a really good piece of work, and I think we did a damn good job, all things considered. But to be slightly more positive, I think this was quite a good example of interdisciplinary research. So obviously there's a lot of ecology here. It's fundamentally a social psychology study. And actually there's even some sociology in there at the end in the discussion of our paper. And that's because we submitted it to People in Nature, which is an interdisciplinary journal. And the editor there, not Kevin, not the editor, suggested that we try and interpret some of our findings in terms of practice theory, which comes from sociology. And at the time, I was like, oh, for God's sake, like, it took absolutely ages. I had to read a sociology textbook, and it was all completely new to me. But having done it now, looking back, it was such a valuable way. It really shed a lot of light on some of the findings that we had. And the reason that I mention it here is that I think it kind of shows that interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research can be a lot of different things, and it can be sort of built in from the very start of a project, or it can be a sort of afterthought that you do later on. And if it's useful in any of those ways, then I think, do it, and that's fine. And we don't have to be too snobbish about what is good and bad. And then example 3, and I won't talk about this too much. This is sort of a couple of years later from the other stuff that I talked about. So there's a bit of a gap with some work that I did with Robbie and Sarah on dormice, which I won't mention just now, but sort of building on the experiences that I had. So my role now is working on a project called Renew, which Kevin leads. And it's got a much longer title, which I'm not going to read out because it's quite a mouthful. But eventually, essentially, it's about trying to figure out how to do nature conservation in a way that works for people, putting people at the heart of that works for local communities, for land managers, businesses. And you can easily argue that this is a transdisciplinary project, or that it's transdisciplinary by design. And that's because, firstly, it's a partnership between Exeter and the National Trust. So they're co-applicants on the grant application in the first place. It involves academics from natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, arts, and actually natural sciences, or natural scientists are in the minority, I think, in terms of the main people working on the project. Also involves loads of external organisations from all sectors. At least 30 were sort of written into the grant in the first place, and that number is probably just going to increase. But obviously what I do is just a tiny part of this massive project. And that's focusing on people's sort of thoughts and feelings and behaviours relating to nature. So why do people go outside? How do they interact with nature? How are those things changing? We're using all kinds of methods, some of them sort of traditional environmental psychology methods, surveys, interviews, things like that. Some much more ecology focused. And there's lots of ways of interpreting or understanding the work that we're doing. But the way that I like to think of it, which Kevin might not agree with, is that it's really about trying to embed ecology and the details of ecology and what we know is important within what's been done in environmental psychology for a long time, in terms of understanding how people affect the environment and how the environment affects people. But the other thing to say is just that the work we're doing now is really supported by strong expertise, and that expertise is built in. So these people are being paid from the offset to help us. We're not having to go out and try and persuade people to help us and make time to do that. So yeah, we're working on our little bit of the project with Joe Garrett and Lewis Elliott and Becca Lovell. They're all based in the medical school, and their experience spans like social psychology, health and wellbeing research, mixed methods, qualitative methods. So everything that we're doing, we've got a really strong basis to do that, and then expertise across the project as well. So really this project, you can argue it's transdisciplinary easily, but still what I do day to day is much more like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, sometimes doing this, sometimes doing that, less sort of bringing that all together. So I think there's also a question of scale. It's sort of perspective and how you look and how closely you look at people working versus projects as to whether or not you describe a project or work as these different types of disciplinarity. So what I've learned from all of this is that I don't think you should be afraid. You should, in my opinion, follow the research questions, follow the problems, try and solve the problems by whatever means necessary. And if that takes you into areas that are slightly uncomfortable, slightly out of your research area, then go there. But as Sarah said, seeking help, guidance, expertise is really, really important. But at the same time, as I've kind of demonstrated, that is not always easy to find, and people aren't just sitting around waiting to help you. Sometimes that just aren't the people with the expertise that you need in your sort of immediate social circle, or necessarily in your institution or anything like that. Sometimes also you're just too ignorant to even realize that you need help. And I've definitely been there a few times. I can admit to being guilty of that. So I think overall it's sort of balancing act between trying to be bold, but also, on the other hand, overreaching. And I'll just finish off by saying that the thing that still keeps me awake at night is wondering, does my research, or does our research actually make a difference in the real world? I'm not talking about getting increasing public awareness or changing policy, but actually when it comes down to things changing in the real world, like, what's the impact? Or to be a bit more positive about it, how can we make more of a difference? And then relevant to this discussion is, does being transdisciplinary help us to make more of a difference? So that's something we can discuss. Yeah, thanks. And I should just also say thanks so much to everyone in the ESI that makes this place the place that it is. I mean, my career's been built here, and I wouldn't have been able to have the opportunity that I've had without everyone here, and yeah, especially people that keep the place running, Kate, Mark, Amy. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ben and Sarah. I mean, I have this overwhelming feeling of feeling really proud of both of you and also sensing how brave you both have been, really. So I'm going to invite our expert panel. Kevin, if you could come join us, that'd be great. And I think Sarah and Bennett, why don't you just sit up here with them, because hopefully we can do some questions.
Like musical chairs.
Yeah, we're gonna use some chairs. I think this is going to be pretty informal, and hopefully we'll go through some initial reflections, thoughts, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience online as well. And I think I'll start with Steve, if that's all right. Just about 5 minutes max. So.
I mean, first of all, thanks for the talks. They were brilliant, and I feel proud. I'm not even from the SI, but I think you should be proud. They were wonderful. And just a few reflections on what they said. First of all, I'll start with some obvious things, but they should be said. Transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, it's about people and the ability to have conversations, and regular conversations and frequent conversations. And I bet if we all started talking informally, quite soon we'd start moaning about the university. But one good thing about Exeter is actually it's quite a good place to have those conversations, to have them regularly. And that's what I really appreciate about this place. And I think you've embodied it, and certainly Sarah and Ben have showed us how important that is. So having that ability. The other thing to pick up on something Sarah said, I'm glad you had a little go at undisciplinarity, because I think craft is really important, and your discipline is important, and it's going to be really hard being you, Sarah, because you do everything so well. But sometimes it is quite good to have a group of people who can cooperate to produce transdisciplinarity. It doesn't all have to be, it's a really stressful position to try and do everything well. But we should also be proud of the individual crafts that we have within our discipline. It's really important to have those. And we should also, when we rush towards multi-trans, all kinds of disciplinarities, we shouldn't forget disciplinarity is actually really important. Okay, so just a few more things. I like the idea of epistemological menace. I've got no memory of what it is or what it really means.
You probably had beer.
Oh, right, yeah. But actually, I'm going to suggest that, and one thing that didn't come through, that I think it did come through a bit, actually, when Ben was talking, but there's another kind of ridiculous sounding term, and that's to be an ontological menace. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because a lot of our versions of interdisciplinarity come from a particular way of thinking, and that is we need a bigger picture, right? We're addressing bigger problems, and therefore we should have views from different places. So it's important when I'm working with, I don't know, anyone from Charles Tyler in biology to sitting on the current avian influenza panel at DEFRA, it's important that I'm a social scientist and every now and again say, well, actually, it's not just about virology, it's also about what farmers are doing, or what, it's important to have these different views. And then we can extend that perhaps, and that's kind of one version, I suppose, of multidisciplinarity. So having the bigger picture, there's then a driver about accountability and knowledge. So how do we govern knowledge? It's important that we're including broader publics in this. And again, that's probably being an epistemological nuisance as well, in the sense that it's actually important to know what lay publics are thinking about anything from climate change to COVID or whatever, what the people think about mask wearing. It's important to know this stuff, otherwise the knowledge we have is next to useless. And there's three rationales usually for that. One is about it's a substantive rationale for better accountability, i.e. we get better knowledge because we've assembled more expertise in different kinds of walks of life, different kinds of experiences. There's a normative rationale, which is about it's actually democratically better. You get science that's more accountable to its public, who are the paymasters, etc. And then there's usually an instrumental rationale, and it builds up trust. Okay, and that's clearly important in terms of if we're going to get the changes that Ben's talking about, then it's really important that we've got a sense of that this science hasn't come from nowhere or out of a kind of, an ivory tower, but it's got already kind of people have built into it and it's got some legitimacy in that kind of sense. But they're all about epistemology, how we look at things and broadening the picture. And what I was picking up from both talks really is actually we're all kind of quite interested in creativity and changing things and doing new things. And in some ways, that's the ontological menace bit. So one of the first projects I worked on was on urban water bowls, right? And it was kind of interesting. We went to English Nations, so we got all these water bowls in Birmingham, and they kind of said, well, they're not real water bowls because they're urban ones. And we said, well, they're coexisting with brown rats. And they said, that's absolutely impossible. And we've done all these kind of things. We said, well, actually, there might be something quite interesting about this site we've found where water bowls are finding a niche within these kinds of burnt out cars and the urban rivers to do things differently. And we thought actually there's something quite interesting here. This is a new kind of object, a new kind of thing. And a lot of what I took Ben to be talking about as well, in that sense of thinking about how to deal with road verges or what making things possible, what can be made possible in these kinds of projects, is about assembling groups together who can build something quite different, build something new. And I think that's really kind of interesting. And it's probably where I'd bring Caitlin in as well. And that's where the art science issues come in, that sort of creativity around disciplinarity. It's not just about assembling lots of views on the same thing. We all know that as we view something, it tends to change. We tend to produce new kinds of objects. And that's really where one of the kind of real powers of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity come. It's actually the creativity, the generativity of that kind of activity. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve.
I'm glad I'm at this end because hopefully we'll say everything before it gets about me. I was asked to fantastic talks, by the way. Let's go back. I was asked recently, no, a couple of years ago, to review a manual on interdisciplinarity. And I found it a deeply distressing experience. Partly because I don't think that's very, it was very mechanistic. It was kind of, go out and find somebody who is the mathematician or the, but critically, the one thing it didn't say was, are you interested in what these other people are doing? Because to me, if you're not, then there's very little point in pursuing. At the heart, I find I have a real challenge with cross-disciplinary, whatever, as being this kind of distinct thing that somehow operates very differently from every other piece of research and collaboration and interaction that we do. If you can't get excited about what your collaborators are doing, if you can't if you don't like them, if you can't kind of engage with them, if you can't have a coffee with them and maybe a beer with them, from what I hear,
Sorry, Steve.
then I think it's a real struggle. I think it's really difficult. And I don't think it's for everybody. I mean, I think there's lots of people who are, they have their 2 square meters of their thing and that's it. And that's what they're interested in. And that's fine. And actually, I think those people will always be the majority of what's happening in academia. And this manual didn't say any of that. So I got deeply upset. I also didn't think it said anything about the sort of, if you like, the kind of different kinds of interdisciplinary. I think we talk a lot about collaborations, producing papers, joint grants, joint media statements. We don't talk very much about the fact that by interacting with somebody else, I change what I do of my own discipline. And I think that's almost, we can't count that. So that's a really difficult thing for funders. It's really hard to count those influences and how that reshapes things. But I think that's almost as important as the collaborations and that easier stuff there is. We have a joint grant together. We have that stuff of by interacting, and I think that's part of the principle of this place. At the outset was actually, it's not all about necessarily joint projects. A lot of it's about the fact that I have a conversation with somebody and I rethink the thing that I'm doing in my discipline and I do it in a slightly different way. And I think that's really important. That was something that wasn't in the manual either. And part of this space, we fought so hard for this space. People wanted to divide this literal space you're sitting in now into offices, put desks in here. If we have a victory of this building, this space has been the most important thing because it's about those discussions over coffee. It's about, it doesn't all have interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, whatever, often isn't going to emerge from the formal meeting. Part of the reason I came here, well, part of the reason I moved institutions was because I got a bit tired of there being some call coming out for a funder call and being asked to go to a meeting in which a load of people would come in who'd never met each other, and somebody would say, so who's got a good idea then? As though that was how we did research, and it was a kind of interdisciplinary call, so kind of we pull all these people who've never met each other. Interdisciplinary for me, multidisciplinary, is about interactions. It's about knowing we work together enough that we know what the next thing we want to do is, and there's a call and we can chase that. And that's why places like this are important. It's about, I got to work with some mathematicians because I happen to get on the bus with them every day. And it's about that stuff. And I think there is a danger that we kind of raise this stuff up into, like, we put it on that pedestal of it's a transdisciplinary. Actually, I think it should be much more a part of what we just do every day. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes there are great discoveries, sometimes there aren't. The other thing I wanted to say was I think there's a fear sometimes of there are all these disciplines out there. How do we manage kind of working with all these different kinds of people, and they're kind of there, you know, the mathematicians over there, they're a bit weird, and social science, and I don't understand what they do. Yes. I actually think that's largely relevant, and I think there are two broad groups of people in research. There are those who are interested in solutions, and their whole thing is about finding an answer to a problem. And there are those who are interested in process and about why you're asking that question in the first place and how do we frame those. And actually, often a lot of the mismatches between people trying to understand each other across disciplines is about that distinction. Because if you're a solution, I come out of a solutions background. It's kind of, you know, I want to know the answer. This is my problem. I want to know the answer. Give me the graph. And for lots of people, that doesn't make any sense at the question at all. And if you don't get that, then it's going to be really difficult kind of understanding it. Of course, that's simplifying the whole of social science into two categories. But those are some of the things that weren't in the manual, and I wish they had been.
Thank you, Kevin.
So going on Sarah's advice or secondhand from Steve about starting with an anecdote, I'll start with an anecdote about having dinner with Kevin. So this Caitlin started out saying that there was a lot of history in here and that there were crusty elders. So before the ESI was established sort of 10 or 12 years ago, Kevin and I had dinner in Exeter to discuss the prospect of me joining this new and experimental venture that Kevin is leading. And we discussed, you know, the whole point of it being to achieve an ambition for realizing the potential of interdisciplinary research. And one of the things I said was that this was very risky for people joining this venture because people who would do well in a university environment are the ones who would build on their existing successes because they had a high chance of getting grant income and getting papers and getting more of that. And the university would appreciate that because they were doing more of what we're meant to be doing. But to step into an interdisciplinary research, it required you to take risk because it might not work. And the ventures that you went at, the grants that you applied for would be hard to be convincing about, and there was a real high chance of failure. And one of the other observations at that time was that actually the people who have the capacity to take those sorts of risks are the well-established, and there's no correlation between your capacity to capacity to make things happen and your willingness to take the risk. And I think that that's a really challenging thing, is that if you're established and you've got a nice thing going on, you're best off sticking with that rather than stepping out into different environments because of the risk of how your success is or indeed failure is measured. So if I reflect on these 10 years or so of operation in the ESI, the metrics are really, really tricky and challenging to be convincing about, but people like Sarah and Ben are actually the real measures of success, because Sarah was an investment that the university made in me establishing my research program and was the first PhD student, and here she is now presenting to you all and talking about her research program. And that sort of metric doesn't appear in any spreadsheets, but is a tremendous contribution. And I'd also sort of think about this metaphor of travel, and 2 episodes in my career, I sort of then around that time of having those conversations with Kevin and deciding to leave a safe and secure place in the civil service where I had a lot of subject matter expertise, and really I knew exactly what I was doing, and stepping, albeit back into university life, but away from that safe place into this fairly risky venture. And then over 10 years, on the face of it, getting pretty reasonably well established in that and doing reasonably well and having a program and doing things that university expects you to do. And then thinking now, well, I've got another 10 or 15 years of this. Should I do something else again in that journey? And so I've stepped out to do a secondment in the Office for Environmental Protection, which is this new public body that's meant to hold government to account for environmental protection. And of course, this is on the face of it a really silly thing to do, because it sort of doubles the amount of work, and it's difficult. And I'm suddenly expected to be accountable for all sorts of things about which I know very, very little. And I've put myself in this difficult and exposed place where I'm having to deal with people from all sorts of different disciplines again. But the opportunity in doing that is to identify new ways of doing things and new ways of knowledge. And I think actually, probably somewhat ironically, I'm stepping out of this interdisciplinary space into what is actually in practice a very transdisciplinary space, because it's about how we use environmental science evidence, how that interfaces with the law, how it interfaces then with politics of how the environment is managed in this country. And then also we're considering what society wants from us too. So a lot of the challenges that we currently face are very difficult to frame without considering a very much more transdisciplinary field of activity. So the challenge for me now is to spot the good stuff while I'm there. I'm only there for 2 years, but to spot the good stuff and remember it, so that when I come back, because while I'm there, I'm going to be subsumed back into another disciplinary way of working, an institutionalized way of working in that sort of public body. And I need to remember what it was that I found interesting about the interface between the lawyers and the politicians and the ministers and the special advisors, and be able to bring that back into how evidence is generated, how it's used, to gain the sort of traction that Ben was frustrated by, or the lack of traction that Ben is frustrated by, because that's where the reality are in this terribly, terribly messy, dynamic and confusing world. And I mean, of course, there are people who study those systems in another branch of our university, but actually how you then reflect on those and generate evidence that is useful and meaningful in that environment is extremely difficult. So if I can remember that, then that journey will have been worthwhile. And I suppose that the last sort of part of my thought is that travel, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that travel requires some element of discomfort. Sometimes, depending on your appetite, that might be like an extended backpacking trip around Southern Asia. It might be a relatively comfortable car journey to a weekend spa break. But it is also always good to come back home. When you get back there, you just have to bring home that additional experience that you've gained whilst traveling. So yeah, be brave, take the discomfort, and hopefully bring back something exotic with you.
It's not a real strength. Trying to get to the destination. All right, thank you, Robbie.
Okay, I need to follow that.
And the last word.
Can I have a crusty elder anecdote first? Which is that, Sarah, your thoughts and your comments really resonated with me in terms of the point was made to you by a seminar speaker about a car crash of a PhD. Yeah. And it reminded me back in the day when I was going into my 3rd year of my first degree, so we're going back with 30 or 35 years possibly. And at Cambridge, you decide in your 3rd year which department to go into to study your final year, because you're quite mixed disciplines until then. And I could choose between, these are the disciplines at the time, botany or zoology or applied ecology. And I said to my tutor I wanted to do applied ecology because it covered soil science and geology and history with Oliver Rackham and plant science. And I was most interested in insects and flowers. That's still the case, in fact. And my tutor said, don't do that, Juliet, because you won't be employable as an academic if you cross that boundary. You have to go into a discipline, otherwise you're not going to be taken seriously. So even, 35 years, the disciplines might have been slightly different, but actually that same point has stuck with me all of that time. And I thought, I kind of still think about it in as much as, why don't I fit in a discipline, or does it matter? And I think it's the point that you also made, that you do stuff that you're really interested in. And I'm interested in getting into those spaces and those gaps, or those interstices, if you like, between things. And that ends up with you dabbling sometimes. And yes, I'm certainly can be, I would hold my hand up to dabbling in the ideas of the social science, and my PhD students covering it extremely well, because they can get into depth in that, and they can be the really interdisciplinary researchers. But actually that piece that you did, Ben, with Jess and Jen was super fascinating to me. And as you say, maybe it's got a very simplistic title, social scientists. But actually it really changed how I thought about what we do. In that I gave a plenary at a bee symposium last September. It was the first keynote on the first morning. And my title was something like "Mind the Gap, have we really saved any bees?" And it was a reflection on all the research that I've done over 30 years on pollinator conservation. Has it actually saved any bees? Are we just banging out more and more knowledge that more and more flowers need more and more bees, and lots of other complicated stuff which really matters, but without changing how people are, or thinking about how people are motivated to do different things? And that might not relate to pollinators at all. It might relate to how tidy they want things, or how much the equipment costs to mow the field, or whatever it is. Without that different perspective, you're not going to get the traction that you need to change the thing that you're interested in. And it was kind of a penny drop moment for me, which I was quite surprised at myself about, in a way. So the other point I just wanted to make was, just at the end here, you said you're proud of what Sarah and Ben were talking about, and I think we all feel that sense of pride as ex-supervisors, but also I'm inspired by it. And I want to mention Katie Shanksey's at the back there somewhere as well, because we haven't talked about any of the kind of engineering and natural science, or engineering and social science connections as well that this place has made. And I would say she's one of the people who's also done that from the generation of people who came in as students or PhDs and came through. And so we are minding the gap. We are scared of the gap. There are risks in falling into the gaps, but actually perhaps we can try and fill those gaps or bridge those gaps and think about it in that creative, positive way, rather than the kind of negative, risky way. I'm going to shut up.
No, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, we're living in the gaps somehow, right? So occupying gaps. We've heard a lot of us talking. Do people have questions? And these can be questions for people on the panel. So it's what we've just heard. Questions for Sarah and Ben. We'll give you a chance to do that. I don't know if anybody's left online. Oh, there are. Yes, we've got lots of people. You're behind us with your discs. But yeah, any questions at all? Thanks. Yes.
So I feel as though I've always worked in quite an interdisciplinary way. I think it to a certain extent it's baked in if you grow up as a geographer. And I'm all for it. Absolutely, I'm all for theoretical eclecticism, methodological eclecticism, exchange, generosity spirit, all of that. Absolutely. I see more and more calls from the research councils that are calling for interdisciplinary research, but I'm not sure they know what they want. And I saw one the other day that was for healthy aging. It was right up our alley. It was like, yeah, healthy aging, great. Let's have a look at this. It was led by MRC, and it was basically MRC. It really felt like it was interventions. You would do your intervention for healthy aging, and the person from AHRC would sit in the corner knitting. That's what it felt like. What's your thoughts about that? Because we are in this world, we're going to struggle for potentially struggle for European funding in the near future. The UKRI is our, that's the home of where we get our research money from. They ask for things, I'm not sure they know what. So how do we engage them in a way that they kind of understand and appreciate and want to fund?
Does anyone want to tackle that one?
Go on.
I mean.
I'll have a go.
So Robbie and Kevin sort of nodding. Robbie, you
Go on
want
then.
to?
Do you remember the scene in the Blues Brothers where they rock up at a Western bar and they say, I'm not sure this is our kind of music. And they said, no, we have both kinds of music here, country and Western. And I think the answer actually is, Kate, that they know perfectly well what they want. It's just that it's not really interdisciplinary. They want, a little bit of microbiology and a bit of biochemistry. So the gaps between them are really not very large at all. So, but it's a gradual process. I mean, the call that Caitlin is just lifting out there, I mean, those are, I suppose, the opportunities, but I mean, the multiplication of challenge that you'd face in creating a convincing research bid, I think, is the major challenge. That if you're going to have disciplinary reviewers and then interdisciplinary reviewers, assuming they can be found, without them already being in the call and having a conflict of interest, and you end up kind of this geometric scale of challenge. And I think that's the problem for genuine innovation. If you really wanted to come up with something that was really quite radical, then I'm not sure Research Council approaches are best set up to achieve that. It may be that there are other funders, and it may be that this one has deliberately tackled that challenge. But I think it's not that they don't know what they want; it's just that they know they don't want that.
And also, I think it's compounded. You talk about the panels. I think there is a lot of problem with panels that I'm not sure they train panels very well to work with what people might come up with.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting gap there, where the call might say one thing,
Yeah.
but unless everybody on the panel is on message, then it's very difficult sometimes for even what they're asking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin, I think you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, I don't entirely agree with Robbie.
Yes.
I think there's an interesting transition happening at the moment where interdisciplinary things in the research councils, until quite recently, were let's bring together a bunch of research councils and let them create some call. And then I think commonly what happened was they would evaluate proposals by saying, well, we put 20% in. I'm not sure this proposal has 20% of that. And I think what's happening at the moment, and I think it's driven particularly around the formulation of UKRI, is that some of the research councils actually are being a bit braver and actually saying, we want to do more interdisciplinary things and we're prepared to do it on our dime. And I mean, as Ben was referring to, I mean, the call that Renew's funded by, which is a big project, was, is funded by NERC exclusively. But actually has a minority of natural scientists, classical NERC fundees, if you like, on it. And what's interesting about that is they know this is an experiment for them. They know this is boldly reaching into territories which are very unfamiliar. And so and that's clearly just one example out of, and I'm sure that some of these things will succeed, some of them will fail. But I think it is an interesting time, and there is a recognition, I think, in some of the councils that they need to be a bit bolder and to try things. Of course, it's one thing to say we're happy, we're prepared to accept that some of these things might fail, and what happens when some of them do fail. But actually, I'm not quite so cynical that actually they do always know what they want and that they actually really want to keep things within their discipline. I think there is a feel at the moment, and then you've got, of course, this whole new pot of money which is cross UKRI, and so where panels is going to be a big thing. Really, the Changing the Environment programme really struggled with that, and actually most of the people on the panels were not academics in the end. They were pulling in people from elsewhere. But I think it's an interesting time. I think there are some interesting new things being done and new things being tried.
I was wondering what you thought about whether researchers should be value neutral. I don't know if we've spoken about values like underpinning the research. Obviously, epistemology, the way you think about knowledge, underpins the research methods of value. But then what you want to look at, if you want it to make a difference, that's kind of a value. If you want it to be about equity and justice for people, that's a value. If you want it to be about conservation of vulnerabilities, that's kind of value. And also from the funding perspective, so from NERC or the SRC or what have you, their kind of value systems of what knowledge is. I really like what Kevin said about the solution and the process. And that seems like quite a neat dichotomy for, I don't like it. I don't like it. Like, obviously, it's more complicated than that, but to me, in my experience, that seems quite a neat dichotomy of like, okay, we need a solution, but hang on, how are you going about it? And who's going to apply it? And who's around the table to figure out the question you're asking? Is it the practitioners? Is it, you know? So I guess that's a question about, should researchers be value neutral? And what are we? Thanks.
Juliet, do you want to weigh in or?
I haven't given this a lot of thought, except to say I almost don't think it's possible to be. I mean, as a natural scientist, we try to be as objective as possible, but our social scientists colleagues we never are. And I understand that now, which I didn't get before. So I don't know that we can be value neutral. I guess we can be clear about what that value the aims are, what solution it is that you're looking for. That's going to set the value from there. I'm looking at Karen because but I'm going to go ahead anyway. So I don't know that we can be. I mean, I think I was just grimacing at the process versus solutions separation that Kevin brought up, because I'm not sure I agree. I feel like a lot of the work that I've done or we've done as a pollinator team, whether it's using engineering and biology or biology and social science, has been about the processes and the mechanism, but with the aim of getting to a solution at the end. And so I feel like we need that to get to there. And I can't separate them personally. So I'm not sure I've answered your question. That's just my perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to disentangle values and objectivity. I think we need to be objective, but if I'm working in, I work in rural Bangladesh, if I go with a badly produced questionnaire, which kind of looks value free and so on, it's just going to be rubbish because I'm going to get useless answers. So I have to go in and be build up a relationship with the people I'm talking about. That's how to get objectivity. It's not, so sometimes it looks like the most scientific method when I'm working with my bioscience colleagues. They look at me as if I'm mad if I'm not using a questionnaire because they want numbers. You're not going to get anything useful out of that. In order to be objective and really learn what's driving a farmer to use antibiotics in their farm, I need to actually understand what's going on in that farm. So there's a difference. This, from feminist standpoint theory, objectivity is not the same as unbiased or whatever. It's actually building up relationships, sometimes being quite close to what you're working on. So that's very different, I think. So it's okay to be, being objective doesn't mean you're value free. It's actually getting engaged with your subject. And I think that does come through in the kinds of things we've been talking about. That helps, I don't know.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thanks to all of you. There is one aspect I haven't heard from you so far, and that's the political dimension of transdisciplinarity. The pretension that as scientists we are somehow disentangled from political debate. At least we inform politicians or policymakers, and we pretend that we don't stand for certain values, or we influence values, views, or whatever you call them. That's one aspect. The other one, which is also political, I think it's more substantial. But the first is relevant for what's happening around us, the role in society. I think the pandemics have just taught us that you can come up with the best vaccine you can, but then people think that this is witchcrafting and there is a theory somewhere that government are controlling them. They will not take the vaccine. What? So that's point number one. Point number two, I think is more substantial. If you want to do good science in 21st century, is the acknowledgement of different knowledges. The fact that we have commodified heavily as Western global North-based scientists, we have exploited heavily without recognizing forms of knowledge in their full ages. So I haven't seen discuss these 2 points, so I'm a bit gloomy, sorry. But I feel like if we don't start by humility and just acknowledging that we've done that, and we are in that space now, we don't take chances.
I think we should stop apologizing for bringing up saying that, because that's going to be more.
Okay. Anyone?
More stated.
It's funny, 'cause my notes had power and politics, and I was like, oh gosh, I'm just introducing, like, I can't go into all that stuff. I just have to see what emerges from the conversation. But I think obviously it's relevant, and I guess I'll turn back to the panel.
I'll expand on the last of your points because that's the one that stuck in my head whilst I was thinking of the earlier ones. But the point about the traditional knowledges, or at least other knowledges, I think you don't have to reach around the world to do that. You don't have to invoke, you know, a kind of colonial powers to understand that the way we create evidence and interpret the stuff that comes to us is very imbalanced in this country, particularly in relation to the environment. So we really don't value at all highly a lot of the experience of, as scientists, we don't value the experiences of people who are managing land. So I think about my area, gamekeepers who manage wildlife and their understanding of their area of ground is lost in the generalization, the characterization of averages across, you know, large areas or large parts of the landscape. So I think there's a tendency in being fairer at how we deal with other people's knowledges in other parts of the world and recognizing how our power has affected that, often for the worse, that we also disregard what's happening in our own backyard. So I agree on that last point, but we don't have to go far away to see the same justices. And actually, we missed opportunities to, you know, in how to effect change. And if you don't accommodate the different perspectives on things like natural resources in particular, then, you know, you centralize it, you detach it from the people who have the ability to effect change and implement policy. In fact, you make them oppose you, and that makes it even harder.
I mean, I totally agree. These really important points. I did that kind of epistemology has come up a lot, and we need to think about epistemological justice as well, and making sure that different kinds of accounts of the world are heard. Without then, I think, because we live in a world, sometimes what's driven this is a kind of deficit approach. So we've got this ivory tower, and then we assume that people are daft and aren't looking after bees properly, or, you know, whatever. So we need to make them more aware. I think actually that's probably wrong. We're in a world of surplus where there's multiplicity of knowledges circulating, and we have to think about how do we put these together properly and well, and that's where the politics come in. I think it's a real challenge. So we're no longer in this deficit world. We are absolutely awash with different kinds of knowledges. How do we evaluate them? How do we kind of find ways of bridging them together is the kind of task in front of us, I think.
Okay, one last question. Yeah.
So I just wanted to talk about power in a slightly different way. And I would, because I'm a politics academic, so that's always funny on that panel. I was interested in this side when I was listening to both of your presentations, which were fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I really, really enjoyed them. I was wondering about identity, academic identity, and how difficult that is, even if you're in a discipline, because we all have to be self-promoting. We have to, you know, have this identity as academics, and that can be profoundly sort of, you know, unsettling. We have to compete. We have to produce this image of ourselves. If you're struggling 2 or more disciplines and trying to be taken seriously, you know, in different fields, and in fields where you feel quite insecure and you lack the experience or knowledge, then that has an impact on you. So I want to talk about those sorts of power dynamics in terms of your position within academia, those hierarchies, and each discipline has a hierarchy, it's a different place in the hierarchy, and just about how the impact of that will be. And things that you don't always feel comfortable talking about within the academy, sort of the hidden impacts.
Do you want me to do that? I don't know. I mean, I suppose it's like I say, it's always been a bit odd for me because a lot of people who end up being disciplinary were in a discipline and then they moved across disciplines. And I genuinely don't know where I would have said that I started off. I don't think anybody knows, frankly, at this point. But in terms of power, I mean, it does mean but it's like anything, right? When I started my PhD here, the biggest challenge I had with power was nothing to do with disciplinarity. It was to do with the fact that the 2 years before I came here, I was working in a university as a reasonably high officer in the Vice Chancellor's office. And I was respected and had power of a sort. And I knew what I was doing, everybody knew what I was good at, and I was in charge of lots of things. And I came here and I was a PhD student, I was like bottom of the pile again. And that was weirder for me than the fact that I was between disciplines. And that's because of the hierarchies of academia, right? Where you come in. So I think, in terms of, within academia, those kinds of negotiating the fact that you do have lots of knowledge about certain things, but they're maybe not the things that academia values. That's actually harder than which discipline it's in. Or at least it has been for me, because most of the time I'm just really nosy about everything anyway. And so I think I've always been interested in what other people are doing. And I guess I do have, even though I don't have a discipline that is, I do have a knowledge base about a certain set of things that's pretty big now. But it's, like I said, it's an area, it's a field that I work in, and that's how I always describe it, rather than a discipline. And then along the way, you pick up expertise, right? So I've got some specific methods expertise now, and because of the kinds of areas I've worked in, I've got some theoretical expertise in some areas much more than others. So I know nothing at all about social psychology, for example. Like, that's really not my thing at all. So you kind of pick up bits of it. And so I don't know if that really answers the question, but I actually personally think that the power challenges I've had in relation to academia relate to where you're considered on the kind of scale of hierarchy in academia rather than my discipline. I don't feel like anyone's ever judged the discipline.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna wrap this up now because we run out.
Sorry, Ben, if you
But I
want
think
No.
What's one of the unique things about this space is that it absolutely assumes that people who are successfully navigating and crossing those borders are, that puts you on the top of the pile in a sense. And there's a different set of values that govern how this place functions. And I think that was the intention. It's funny listening because I'm just remembering, just to do a little more history. The last time that we sat and had this kind of discussion, I mean, we maybe did a little bit of it when Juliet took over as director, but we definitely did a lot of it in 2013, where we would just all sit and sort of thrash stuff out together. And I remember very clearly the discussion that happened between Juliet and Kevin at one of our St. Michael's retreats back then. And it wasn't about process and solution, it was about process and product at that point. So I was a geographer, humanities, sort of social scientist person. I was listening to these two, what I perceived to be two sort of natural scientists. And you guys got into a discussion about whether you needed a product, so a value, a metric. At the end of the journey, there was a number that you could say, this is what we found out. Or whether you were more curious about, well, what are the bees doing? Why are the bees doing what they're doing? And I had the little epiphany that like, oh, okay. So actually there's very little, but there's more difference than sameness in the way that these people are coming out what they're doing. And actually that difference isn't about disciplines, actually. There's something about the texture of difference in the way that people make sense of the world. And I think Kevin reopened that with process solution. But I think that's also something that I really value about being in this space. And I just want to thank everybody for being really generous. So thank you. Your evenings, come back for other ESI 10 events. I can't rattle them off, but Dave told you about them and they're all on the website. Take care. Thanks again, guys.
I just really.
It's very late.
That's what it is.